All right, and here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Welcome everybody. Actually, since this is recorded, I'm going to make sure to put this out there. And Brett, you missed it up first. Just out of clarity, everybody in Prescott as well as everybody in Biltmore, I am your first phone call. So I know there's a little bit of confusion around that with all the merging and changing and all that kind of stuff. Jim Dunning is our designated broker. Kate Madison and I are the two managing brokers. And the way we kind of split it up is basically everybody out of Prescott and everybody out of the Biltmore office. I'm their first phone call, so I'm y'all's first phone call. And then anybody that's associated with the Scottsdale or High Street office, Kate is their first phone call. Now, if you don't get me and it's urgent, your second phone call is Kate, right? And so give her a shout. And I'm in the same boat in the other. If the High Street gives Kate a call and she's not available, their second phone call is me. Just utilize that. Call me. I'm always good for that. You only call Jim if like there's legal things, like if people are shouting lawyer and there's lawsuits flying around the air. 90%, not more than that, probably 98% of all of the matters Kate and I can handle before we get to any sort of legal affairs. So run it through us first.
Can you share Kate's contact information? Because I don't know who that is. I
can. In fact, I will make sure it's up on the Facebook page for everybody to know. Okay. We've got a form email that's going out that's defining this a little bit better. So make sure everybody has that contact. So excellent. Now I'm going to share my screen and dive into a couple of documents. So two that I thought of today were well, the Solar Addendum that came up recently is just something we're going to run into more often, because as there's more and more solar out there, we're going to run into people that are selling it. And so we need to know what this Solar Addendum does. So I'm going to add that. And the other one, because we're more in a balanced market, I'm going to go up here and where is it? Buyer Contingency Addendum. So we're going to talk about those two. I'm going to add them in here. Did everybody on here get an email for, talking about the changes in DocuSign? Did anybody on here get that? Has anybody seen what those changes are?
I haven't seen them yet. I did get the email, but I haven't seen the changes.
If you guys are familiar with the pre-tagged roles, when you go into envelopes and you can add a pre-tagged roles, and basically instead of you having to go add those pre-tagged roles, it adds them automatically in the envelope. The only drawback in that is that it'll add all of the pre-tagged roles. So you may have to remove some, right, if they aren't specific for what you're dealing with. But they automatically go in there. You just tell it which client is that role. And then going into the envelope and actually setting the signatures is pretty much all done for you. So it actually just kind of made it one step easier. And if you're familiar with either Dotloop or Transaction Desk, it made it just a little bit more like that, right? As far as streamlining that process. All right, let's go into the Solar Addendum first. You guys tell me if you can read this, or I need to download it and get it bigger. We're just going to walk through. It's one page. We're going to walk through it line by line. It's pretty straightforward. You know, the top end of it is your normal contract. It states some information. A PV panel system has installed on premise. It shall convey with the premise pursuant to the terms below, and you're going to mark some qualifications about it. If it's owned by the seller utilities, I like how they've started to do this in AAR forms. Here are the instructions on how to fill out this form. Lines 10 through 13, or how do we do this? So if it's owned and not subject to a lease or an unpaid loan, so that's key. So a lot of people own their system but still owe money on it, right? Have a loan on it. Then mark the appropriate box on line 14 and complete sections line 1 and 3. Sections 1 and 3. If the solar system's installed and is leased or has an unpaid loan, then you need to make sure to fill out the appropriate marks box on line 23 and complete sections 2 and 3. So seller owned or utility owned solar system. We don't have a whole lot of utility owned solar systems in Arizona. That is common in some other states. We like to own the stuff that's on our roof, but there do exist situations where APS or SRP has contracted the right to put a solar system on somebody's house, so that that system is actually owned by the utility versus the seller. And so this is the box that you would check and have them initial it and move forward. And really, when there is a utility owned system, there is some more paperwork that will have to be done with the utility to transfer the responsibility rights, but not much else. There's no money, there's nothing else, there's no approval. It's not like transferring a lease or anything like that. It's pretty simple, other than the fact you're dealing with a utility, which aren't always the fastest. So I guess one thing you always think of when we have another addendum and we have other things is that there's probably somebody else involved, and they probably have different timelines and different urgency schedules. So get things done early and quick. So if you meet with them and they're like, yes, and the utility owns it, say, awesome, we need to start engaging with that utility now before we get under escrow, right? And make sure the utility knows what's going on so we can make things happen as fast as possible. So this is fully owned and you don't owe any money. Solar lease or loan, and this is where a lot of owners are going to have confusion. They're going to think they own the system, so Section 1 applies, but they owe money on it. That's incorrect. They need Section 2 because they do have a loan on the loan on those panels. So it says here, lease loan assumption contingency, buyer's obligation to complete the sale is contingent upon buyer obtaining from lessor approval to assume the solar system lease or loan under the existing terms, no later than 3 days prior to close of escrow. That is also if the loan is being transferred, right? So if the loan is not being transferred, if you're building in the payoff of that loan into this sale, and you're not transferring that at all, or the seller is paying it off, you know, if you got $3 grand left or something like that, and seller's just going to pay it off, then you treat it as in a fully seller owned, because you're not going to be contingent on the buyer having to be approved for that loan or that lease. Does that make sense? I kind of backtracked a little bit there, but I want to make sure everybody's following that. So if it's being paid off, then it's just like this Section 1. This disclosure, seller disclosure. Let's read this real quick. Within 3 days of contract acceptance, 3 days. So like a clue or like a SPUDS. Seller shall deliver to buyer most recent version of the solar system lease loan. So they've got to pull out their lease or loan paperwork. They'll deliver it to the buyer, all the solar system documents in seller's possession, so everything. Provide the buyer the name and the phone number of the lessor, and notify the lessor of sale and the name of the buyer and the name of the escrow company set forth in Section 3A of the contract. So this is kind of getting you on top of what we talked about earlier. There's a third party involved in this. Get them involved as quick as possible. This is not something to wait till after the inspection to figure out. This is not to wait till after appraisal. Within 3 days of contract acceptance, you need to be getting these other people involved as quick as possible. And they're all pat. The next line on that 29 and 30 is just, we're going to call these the solar system documents, like that. You can have like Earth and Pluto and Mars. All right. Wait, Pluto's not a planet anymore, but it's still in the solar system. I can count it, right? All right. Lease loan assumption contingency, we just went over that. Buyer disapproval. Buyer shall provide notice of any solar system related items disapproved within the inspection period or 5 days after receipt from seller of the solar system documents, whichever is later. Buyer's failure to deliver assigned a notice of cancellation within the specified period shall conclusively be deemed Dine's election to proceed with the transaction, subject to any other contingencies foreseen, blah, 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 blah. Should buyer elect to proceed with the transaction, buyer shall immediately apply for lease loan and all that kind of good stuff. So you need to get these documents that it talks about up here in seller disclosure to that buyer as quick as possible, because the buyer does have time to say, you know what, this lease sucks. I don't want any part of it. I'm out. And they can cancel the contract because the solar lease is not good, right? If you're representing the buyer needs to do everything they can to find out as much as they can within 5 days of receiving those documents or within the inspection period, whichever's later, because they don't get to the end realize what their solar lease payment is and what their house lease payment is, house mortgage payment is, and not like that math and get out of it because they've already passed their time period. So we need to be extra protectionist of that time period and getting those documents.
So question in regards to the inspection. I'm guessing it's going to have to be a completely separate inspection.
If you want the solar system, the actual PV system inspected, yes, I would say I don't know any general inspectors right now that have capacity to inspect a solar system, right?
Do you any of you guys, the other agents, do you guys have any contacts for that?
So the only time I've done it is I've called out the solar company that actually put mine on, just a solar company, and they can come out and just take a quick look at all the panels, make sure they're in decent condition, look at the inverter and see how old it is, and that's about, and look at the switch gear, right? Really, there's not like they can't test it to see. Yeah, they can't. There is no real test to like.
They can see what it's producing just by logging into the inverter and seeing what production rate is, so on and so forth. Right. So they can do a calculation without even getting on the roof to make sure that the panels are performing as they should. Right. And so on and so forth. So yeah.
And notice on here that I mean the panels not performing as they should. That would be in your inspection. That's not part of this solar lease or solar addendum right here. That's part of your general inspection. So just like if the air conditioner wasn't performing as it should, if the solar system is not performing as it should, then that's something you can put in the binzer, right? To ask them to either double check or see what's going on. Just know that.
Mine was. Go ahead.
I was going to say, know that those people that come out and fix solar PV systems are probably not in our typical binzer timeline. That could be like, I'll be out there in November to see if I can't work on that. So there may be some renegotiation around that. Also know that, and the solar installers will know this. There is an acceptable amount of degradation in solar production over time. So if that solar system has been on there for 10 or 12 years, it's not going to produce what it did at day one, and it's expected to be so. And so you would need to, I would hope that the solar installers would be able to say that, explain that to your clients. And if your clients are concerned about it, to say there is an expected amount of degradation, and it's gonna be there. It's unavoidable, and you can't expect it to perform on year 10 as it did on day one. It's just not going to.
Correct.
Right. You don't have to be technical about it, but there you go. What do you got, Chris?
Generally on leases, the leasing company, whether it's Solar City, I had Solar City, I used to work for them. Or, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the others. They generally maintain those systems if it's a lease. Yes. And if the panels go bad, they replace them, as well as inverters, so on and so forth. If anything, if they notice, they'll see it, they'll replace it. I had basically a brand new system when I sold my house in California, because they replaced all the panels because there was a defect and water was getting in, and it was shorting out the system, and the inverter went the same week.
Right. So, and those leases will typically have a planned degradation of power. So if it's like 3% a year or 2% a year, or by year 10, they have to be producing at least 80%. The leases will have that built into their system. So you can have them take a look at it. Again, keep an eye on timelines. Know that they're not going to know you needed this done in 10 days. It might not be able to do it. But if you can call the lease company and say, I just need you to inspect it, make sure it's performing at, within spec, and they come out there and it's performing at 75%, it's supposed to be 80, then it's on them to fix it. And they will, because it's technically still their product, right? It's in their best interest to fix that, because if it's fixed and the lease ends and they go to a sell, if they have fixed it, it's worth more, and they can actually sell it to you for more money. So there you go. Unfulfilled lease or loan assumption contingency. Let's go to line 40 here. Contract shall be canceled. The buyer shall be entitled to return earnest money if, after diligent and good faith effort, buyer is unable to obtain assumption approval from lessor and delivers a signed notice of inability to obtain that approval no later than 3 days prior to close of escrow. It's also assumption approval means lease or loan, right? If they fail to deliver such notice, seller may issue a cure notice, all that about cure and that kind of stuff. So if the buyer doesn't qualify for the lease or the loan assumption, then the buyer can exit the contract and get their earnest money back. There are a lot of times are transfer fees. So just like a HOA, this here defines who's paying for that transfer fee, right? And they could be $75 or they could be $1,000. They're all over the place. And this little line right here might be important. Solar tax credit loan balance. Seller buyer responsible for paying any required reduction in loan balance as it relates to eligible solar tax credits that may be necessary prior to assume the solar system loan. Basically, there are tax credits that a lot of the lenders or lessees are using in order to credit against that lien. And if it transfers those credits go away. And this is saying that the seller has to make up for those unused credits if it were to transfer and they go away. Effectively, I'm going to make up numbers, but let's say it's a $20,000 system and they got a $5,000 credit, and that is amortized out over 5 years, $1,000 a year over the next 5 years, and you sell it in 3 years, then the seller needs to come up with $2,000 to make up the extra $2,000 that they're not going to get. They're not going to get that from the state because that had been issued to the seller, and so the seller has to utilize that. And consult your CPA. Here we go. Next thing, additional terms. Buyer, any change in current rate plan made by buyer may result in increased rates. This just says that, hey, if you get the solar system and you put it on a different rate plan with your power company, it may be different rates. So I think this is belt and suspenders kind of style here, because effectively that's true along anything, right? If the buyer has an awesome rate plan with the power company and or the seller has an awesome rate plan with the company and they're showing you their low bills, and the buyer comes and uses a different rate plan and they get higher bills, the buyer is the only one to fault there, right? The buyer used a different rate plan. Seller, if electric utilities are on at contract acceptance, seller shall ensure that they remain on through close of escrow. Again, this is actually built into the purchase contract, but they're just sticking it in here again. Like, hey, you can't shut stuff down, right? Mid-contract. And that includes the solar PV system. Buyer due diligence. Here are some things that the buyer may want to know about when they're going in this. The age of the system, if there is battery storage, how many batteries, all that kind of stuff. The end of the lease, the loan terms, all that kind of stuff. If there's any sort of grandfathered utility plan. I sold my house, but I did have this awesome grandfathered utility plan on it. And I leased that house, and I had written and I initialed in very, very specific terms for all my tenants, they are not to change their APS utility plan. If they do, then they are responsible for all APS charges above and beyond that, plus some sort of, I think I built in like a $500 or an $800 penalty, because it's going to screw me I can't get back into that plan. So I was serious about it. So whether it's grid tied or standalone, homeowners insurance coverage, maintenance, output production guarantees, we just talked about that. If there are any payment increases, whether it's a loan or a lease, if there are escalations yearly. Roof integrity, did they put it on a bad roof? Have a roofer come out there. If there are any taxes or utility fees or anything like that, the actual utility bills. Again, note past performance is not a guarantee of future results. I think that's generally a good rule in life. And if there are any warranties on the panels or inverter battery installation, that kind of stuff. And you should note that warranties aren't all the same. So there may be a 20-year warranty on the panels and a 5-year warranty on the inverter, and no warranty on the batteries. So just like a car, you've got, bumper to bumper, but really that only covers the bumpers. And then you got all the other stuff that's only covered for, the next 6 feet. Then the very last here is, make sure, conduct your due diligence. And this is a big thing, go find all the information you want. And if there are any additional terms, you can write in here. Additional terms that I've seen in solar, really, I've only seen a few, like there be training on how to use the management system, right? Especially if it's an off-grid system, like how do we use the management system? Well, you build in the additional terms like seller to spend an hour with the buyer on training on the off-grid management system, that kind of stuff. So I don't know what other additional terms might be in here. This is pretty straightforward. And then you sign it, you're good. All right, what other questions you got about the Solar Addendum? That was it? I explained it all perfectly. Love it when that happens. Yes. All right. Well, we are at 9:54. I am totally cool with going into the Buyer Contingency Addendum, as long as everybody's good with hanging on. All right, good deal. Because normally this is about 30 minutes, and it's going to go longer. If y'all are good. All right, then we're going to dive into the Buyer Contingency Addendum. I know Jennifer's waiting for this. She's like, come on, Solar, stop it. Give me here. Okay, Buyer Contingency Addendum. So this is the addendum that's used when a buyer has to sell a property in order to buy another property. You know, the other document I probably should have pulled up is the LSU or the prequal. Because in the prequal, the lender actually checks a box whether the buyer is relying on the sale or some disposition of another property in order to buy this house. That's pretty key. If the prequal does not have that checkbox checked, and you use this Buyer Contingency Addendum just as a savvy seller's agent, if I saw that the lender is not actually requiring it, but the buyer is doing this, that changes things a little bit. That means like they're choosing to make this contingent, right? It's not forced as far as financing, but maybe they do want some of this money to go towards down payment, but they've got money elsewhere. They just don't want to take it out of their 401k. So you can still use this Buyer Contingency Addendum even if the lender is not requiring it. But as a savvy seller's agent, you should be reading that LSU or the prequal to see if it truly is required for the lending, right? Now, what does that have to do with anything? That means that they can't use their non-sale of their property as a reason to be not qualified to borrow on the property, right? So if this property doesn't sell, then they can't say we don't qualify for our loan, so we're going to use the loan contingency. They've got to stick within this buyer contingency set. So it just means that this doesn't affect the loan at all. This is just affecting their desire to purchase the property. So let's dive into this. This is built into two sections. The first section is the first page and part of the second page, and then the second section is this little line 49 to 66 on page 2. First section is built around buyers that still have to sell their property, right? So it's not under contract, maybe it's not even listed. I don't know, that like they're super early in the process. So it says it's contingent on the buyer accepting a purchase offer, an offer to purchase located at this no later than blank, blank, blank. If buyer does not accept an offer on the buyer's purchase by date, this contract shall be deemed canceled and the earnest money shall be released to the buyer. So that's a hard date, right? You put that as September 30th, then on October 1st, this contract is canceled. And you don't have a contract on it. There is no accepted offer by September 30th. Then October 1st, this whole purchase contract is gone, right? So there's no cure. There's no extra stuff. If you don't edit this, then this is one of the few places in there in a purchase contract that does lay this out super discreetly. You put a date in here, then the day after that date, if you don't have an accepted offer on the buyer's property, then this contract is canceled and that earnest money goes back. You're done. So be aware of that, because it's not the title companies aren't going to treat it as statutory, but if you're representing your buyer and this date passes and you haven't done any addenda or anything like that to extend it, then all the seller has to do is say, hey, pursuant to Buyer Contingency Addendum lines 10 and 11, this contract is canceled. Please return the buyer their earnest money. We're going to go find somebody else. And the buyer doesn't have anything to say about it. Right? You just get your earnest money back and go beg for forgiveness. All right. Next little bit. Accepted offer for buyer's property. If buyer accepts an offer on the property by the date set forth in line 10, bing, and they shall deliver the accepted offer documents as described in line 67 to 72. We're going to talk about that later. That's down here. or sellers within 3 days or blank days, the accepted offer. Wait, let me, I scrolled up and down and lost where I was reading. Shall deliver the accepted offer documents which has 60, 70, 72 seller or seller's review within 3 days or blank days of execution of accepted offer. So when the buyer actually receives that accepted offer, you send that offer to the seller of this property, right? You send it straight over. If buyer accepts an offer on the property yet fails to deliver the accepted offer documents to seller, then the seller can issue a cure notice. So this isn't so hard and fast. The seller has to cure it, gives a chance to like fix things, that kind of stuff. So it's a potential breach, and it's curable. If the buyer doesn't cure it, doesn't do anything, still doesn't produce those documents, then the seller can cancel the contract and keep the earnest money. So if the buyer gets a purchase contract but doesn't want to send it to the seller, like doesn't want to divulge what they're selling the house for, the seller can say, okay, well then go pound sand and I'll keep your earnest money. Seller may, within 3 days after receipt of accepted offer documents, cancel this contract and the earnest money shall be released to the buyer. Jennifer, that's probably the line you were talking about, right? Yeah, lines in 18 and 19, that really is. Seller may, within 3 days of receipt of the accepted offer documents, cancel this contract and the earnest money shall be released to the buyer. That's only 2 lines, but that's a pretty powerful statement, right? When the buyer sends those documents over and says, hey, we have a contract on our house, the seller has another opportunity to look at those contract documents and say, there's no way you're going to sell this house. Like, this guy is FHA, non-qualified, they're way overextending. There's no way this contract is going to complete. And you're just going to keep my home off the market for another 30 days while you figure that out. So I'm going to cancel. Right, within 3 days of receipt of those things, I, the seller, can cancel this document. Now the earnest money does go back to the buyer. It's not like I get damages for that as far as the seller, but that goes back to the buyer and we're done. So what are your questions and thoughts around that, Jennifer? I know you brought that up specifically. You do have to unmute though. So.
It's a little further down, actually. It's a line around in the line 50s.
In the second set. Okay, then we'll get there. Sorry, I thought this was the 3 days that you were talking about earlier. Then we'll get there in a minute. Sorry.
So I did have a question though. So the seller's agent is looking for things that just don't make sense, that's going to buy more time or have the deal fall apart.
Right.
Okay.
You have a it's a strange little like love triangle that's going on, but the seller now has a reasonable amount of interest in the buyer's buyer, right? And the buyer's buyer performing. So the seller gets to look at how good a performance that buyer's buyer is, right? How good a client that is. You know, if that offer is just ridiculous, now you can analyze that and just see, like, is this a straw buyer that they're just using to waste time and grow things, or what? Or is this a legit set that we're gonna move forward on?
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so on to the next one. Buyer's contingency. If seller does not cancel this contract within 3 days of receipt of the accepted offer documents, this contract shall be contingent upon closing the pending sale of buyer's property by blank date. Now, here's where I get a lot of confusion from agents, is they're writing in these dates when we're writing this offer, and we're putting a no later than date here, but we may get a contract before then, right? I don't know whether that contract is going to be a 30-day contract or a 60-day contract, or I don't know what. So then what date do I put in here, right? So it's currently the September 16th. If I said we're going to get a contract on it by September 30th, if at the latest September 30th, and this was a 30-day contract, then I want that to be 10/31, right? But if we got a contract tomorrow, it's likely to close before 10/31. And that's where it would be wise as the seller to write an addendum. So let's say, let's hypothetical this, right? This is a actual document I'm writing up. I said I want to get an accepted offer no later than 9/30/2022 and close that no later than 9/31/2022. Now, if I get a contract on this property tomorrow, on the 17th, and the close date on that property is the 17th of October. If I don't edit this date, then I still get until 10/31 as far as this contract to close that property. So extensions on the closing of that buyer's contingent offer would still be able to apply. If I'm the seller in this situation, I get their documents that they provided, the accepted offer documents, and I see what their close date is, and I offer up an addendum and say, buyer contingency clause, line 21 to read 10/17/2022. Right, I just edit that to match their contract documents so that they're bound to my contract to close on that date just as well as they are their contracts to close that date. Does that make sense? Not absolutely necessary. It's a protection area of your seller, right? It doesn't, you don't get this overlap dates of the buyers being able to kind of be wishy-washy around that close date. All right. If the pending sale of buyer's property does not close escrow by this date, the contract shall be deemed canceled and earnest money shall be released to the buyer.
Hey, Chris, quick question.
Go for it.
Would you recommend that date on line 21 match the COE on the contract?
Yes. Match the COE on the buyer's buyer contract.
In the initial offer.
Right. In the offer from no, from the offer that's on the buyer's contract that they're trying to sell.
No, I mean when you're putting in an offer and you're using the contingency addendum, I'm asking, would you recommend that date right there match the proposed COE on the contract?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
They can, right? It definitely can't be after, right? You could, and not necessarily.
Okay.
Depending on how your contingency, what your contingent around, right? If you're contingent around, if the buyer is contingent around they need the cash, then it's nice to close on this before they close on the next property, because then they have the cash in hand, right?
Oh, okay.
If they're gonna shotgun close and end finance on another property and finance a new property, then those are gonna be on the same day, no doubt, right? So that's why I say it can be, but that's not a hard fast rule.
Okay, cool. Makes sense.
Yeah, good question though. All right, cancellation of accepted offer for buyer's property. So if the buyer accepted offer cancels for any reason, buyer shall deliver notice to seller within 3 days of buyer's receipt of cancellation and provide evidence of cancellation. Notice to seller shall include buyer's election to either immediately cancel this contract or proceed by removing the buyer contingency. So it's basically, I got to get out or I'm going to remove the contingency altogether, right? These are the two options that are listed in this contract. What's the third option that exists? An addendum to extend this contingency to the next contract, right? So you can addend and change the dates and say, all right, we'll let you go out and get another offer, right? That's not listed in here because they don't want to just have that door wide open that the buyer can just continually use, I want another offer kind of thing. They're basically saying, cancel this contract or remove the contingency. And we all know that with an addendum, we can edit this contingency and change those dates, right? If our seller is so obliged to allow that, and the buyer seems, diligent and willing to go find another buyer for their property. All right, this next section here, seller's acceptance of backup contract. This is what defines this first. So we're in this first area of contingency. It goes down to line 48. This lines 33 through 39 is what makes this part of the contract fairly weak. This contingency weak, right? It allows the seller to continue to market the property, usually under UCB or CCBS, it's UCB up in Prescott, right? They call it under contract accepting backups, something like that. So if the seller accepts a subsequent offer to purchase the premise, before buyer has delivered the seller accepted documents, seller may deliver written notice to the buyer informing buyer of the backup contract. Upon receipt of the seller's notice, buyer shall have 3 days or blank to deliver seller a written notice to either remove this contingency. Such notice shall include these documents from the lender saying blah, 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 or exit the contract, basically. If buyer fails to timely waive the buyer's contingency, the contract shall be deemed canceled and the earnest money shall be released to the buyer. So seller has a backup offer that shows up. They then send the written information to the buyer saying, hey, I have a backup offer. You either need to remove the contingency and buy it under the existing terms or get out of the way. Right. And we have that ability. So when we're consulting with our buyers and they're like, well, I have to put my house under contract before I want to buy a house, right? Or I'm contingent upon selling my house. This section right here, 33 to 39, is the section right here that would convince them to put their house on the market and wait till they have an offer on it, till they go offer on another house, right? Because this right here, they could have their house on the market, have their offer, and have their house on the market for a while, thinking that they're going to be moving into this new place. The seller receives another offer, kicks them out of line. Now they're selling their house, but they don't have a house that they're purchasing, right? So now they have this freak out of possibly being homeless, right? Any questions around that clause? It's pretty straightforward, but it's probably the strongest clause in here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you're helping a buyer, it's kind of scary.
It is, totally. Like if the seller, you can be all charms and flowers as far as your relationship, but that seller gets a nice offer, they're gonna ask you to remove the contingency or step out of the way. And you've got to do so, right? So important.
So can you write a contract for your buyers to amend that? So it's not an option to accept backups?
Can you amend that? You mean amend lines 33 to 39 out of this contingency addendum to eliminate the seller's right to do that?
Yeah.
So yes, you could do that. If I was a seller, I would never sign that, right? You could totally remove those lines out of there and remove the seller's capacity to do so. And if you represent a seller and a buyer proposes that to you, I would highly recommend not signing that document.
So if we go under contract with a contingency with this contract, we as agents have to, absolutely have to put on the MLS active with contingency.
Oh yeah.
Instead of, just regular pending.
Yes. You want to put it active with contingency because that does two things. One, it informs that there's a contingent contract, and two, that is still an active status for syndication.
Backups.
So like all of those other syndicated, your Zillows and Realtors and elookyLoo.com and all those kind of stuff, they don't have all these wacky coming soons, UCB active with contingency. They don't have all of those status. They have active, pending, and sold. Right. So you want your seller's property to be still marketed out there.
Right.
That's your job to get that. So you want it to be active with contingency, because all of the other syndicated sites are just going to see that as active.
Right.
Unless still be marketed.
Unless the seller agrees, to sign that document that you and Jennifer were talking about, or, signing that addendum saying that they will not be taking.
If the seller says, I don't want it marketed anymore, then follow the seller's instructions. That's going to have to be the seller's choice, because that's your seller telling you to stop doing what you were paid to do, which is to find them the highest and best offer. Right. And as long as this is still has a contingency on it, then it's still an active marketable property, and you should, as your fiduciary, is still be trying to find more buyers and better offers. Right. Okay. But if that seller's like, it's too much for my brain, I don't want to handle it, stop doing that, then pend it. get that written from the seller saying, we're electing to not put our, contract in pending or in UCB or active with contingency. We want to pend it and not market the property anymore. Yeah. All right. Last little bit in this first section, time periods. Basically, you can start your time periods one of two ways. Either the date that the signed contract or any incorporated counteroffer is delivered and received by appropriate broker, means like your 10 days for your inspections, your 5 days for your for your clue, your 3 days for your spuds. You can start those the day that you sign this contract, or 3 days after seller's receipt of buyer's accepted offer documents. Now, there's no right or wrong here. I've seen it go both ways. Some buyers are like, I want to get in there and figure out if I really want to be under contract on this house now before I get an accepted offer on my house. But that also means they're going to spend, $500 to $1,000 on inspectors and find all that information out. And, and if they don't get an offer on their house, then they're just out that money. So it's a 6 of one, half a dozen the other. It's good to explain to your buyers what this means, when they can have their inspections and when they're expected to get documents from the seller for their ability to, adjust this contract. And it's up to them. It's up to their comfort level and what they want to spend and what time they want to spend on stuff. So no right or wrong answer there. Okay, so that is the first section for a buyer that does not have an accepted offer on their property yet. The second section, starting on line 49. Notice it's a lot shorter, 49 to 66. That's it. And this section is for buyers that already have an accepted offer to purchase their property, right? And it bumps into here, and it basically says that we're expecting, we have this property and we have an accepted offer and we're expecting it to close by X date, right? And at this point, you have a date, like that contract has a COE. So this should match the COE of that buyer's contingent property, right? And then it does dive in here a little bit of protection for the buyer. If the buyer's accepted offer cancels, then they deliver notice to the seller, and the seller can either back out, or the seller gives the buyer the chance to either cancel and get out of the way, or remove the contingency and still continue, or of course by addendum extend time periods and move things around, right? It has just a statement in here as far as time periods. Time periods start the date of contract acceptance. This doesn't have this floating time period capacity here. They start right away. And this section here around 33 to 39, that doesn't exist here. So the seller does not have the capacity to accept backup offers and move that client out of the way. So you're under contract and you're sticking to it. Now, that's pretty cut and dry, this section of it. The very end of it is, hey, what are the documents that we need if there's anything extra? It does state some things when it talks about what documents do you need on that whatever the buyer is selling on that document. It says accepted offer documents, including the purchase contract, evidencing the sale, and if there's anything else. Typically, buyer's pre-qual or pre-approval. Not all states require that in the contract. Our AAR says, the buyer shall include the pre-qual in this document, but not other states don't require that. So you might not see that. So you may see the purchase contract, but not the strength of their buyer, right? And again, as your seller has a kind of tertiary vested interest in that contract, then they have authority, or not authority, but they have at least ability to see these things in order to execute a good decision on whether this is something they want to move forward with, right? So buyer's pre-qual, pre-approval. I don't know what else you would put in here. if there's any, if this is a whole domino effect, if that buyer is also contingent on stuff, you might want, the lender information or some other information on how to, how fragile is this house of cards? That's what you're trying to put together here.
Question.
Yeah.
So as the buyer's agent, I'm the one filling this out, but what if I'm on the selling agent side of it and a buyer presents me with this contingency agreement and I want to protect my sellers by having the buyers provide the prequal? Do we make an addendum to this, or how do we do that?
You would make a counter.
Okay, so
Right,
in the
'cause this is part of the
counteroffer-
offer. So the counter offer is a buyer contingency addendum line 70 to read buyer prequal.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool, good to know.
There you go. If buyer fails to deliver timely notice required in this addendum, seller may issue a cure notice, your standard cure notice in any contracts. Status update upon request, buyer shall provide seller a written update regarding status of buyer's property. This is important, right? So again, if you as the seller, the seller's agent, you want to keep track of that buyer and their contract. So you can go in and request, hey, what's an update? Give me what's going on. Send me the LSU, send me what's going on. You have the right to request. You don't have a right to intervene or to negotiate or anything like that. You have the right to know what's going on. And then you sign it and all's good. Bob's your uncle. All right. I have before, and this is just something it's not necessarily needed, but I have before had agents, enter into a contract using this first section because their buyer didn't have an offer, right? And then when their buyer did have an offer, they created an addendum to change their buyer to move their buyer under this section of the contract. That was really to remove this clause right here, the 33 to 39. It's not necessary because it does say if seller accepts subsequent offer to purchase before buyer has delivered seller accepted offer document. So basically, as soon as your buyer delivers these offer documents that you're supposed to deliver, then this section, this 33, this 39, 33, 39, that goes away. Right. So as soon as you go under contract, as soon as that buyer goes under contract on their contingent house, then the seller can't rip it out from underneath them. Right. So that doesn't continue along. That is only up until the buyer delivers those documents of the under contract. So there's no reason to rewrite or addend or change the classification of which section we're under in this addendum. Jennifer, the 72-hour, the 3 days that you were speaking of, where exactly were you touching on?
33 through 39.
Okay.
So I need to study the UCB, I guess, because that raised more questions. And so I think that'll come together better for me.
Okay. As far as in the MLS, when you actually classify it as UCB or active with contingency, I think that's what Prescott calls it, right?
Yeah, I mean, just what's standard or what's boilerplate or what conversation has to happen between the sellers and buyers. I'm in this situation possibly later today, so
okay,
on my mind.
Gotcha. All right. Well, as soon as you have an accepted offer that has anything to do with this document right here, the MLS should go to some other status other than just flat out active, right? Active with contingencies, UCB, something. I'm mixing up my alphabet soup between armless and par, so it's one of those, right? And our responsibility in this is to keep marketing this and try to get your seller the best offer. So that's your best way of doing that. Unless, of course, like what Francelli mentioned, if the seller doesn't want that, you get that in writing and you can go full pending and not market it anymore. As long as you get that in writing, because when you go pending, it disappears off those other sites, right? And your seller needs to know that the house, the ability to market the house is being diminished tremendously by going pending. Okay, what other questions? All right, I did it again. I have perfect situation. Explained all of the contract details in absolute perfection. Love it.
You know, after doing a few of them, I mean, I know in this time frame that the first section isn't generally as strong of a buyer's contingency as it would be with the second one.
Absolutely.
Having an offer already accepted. I encountered this with some buyers that were coming from out of state, and they denied it because their house wasn't on the market yet, and all that sort of stuff. But once their house went on the market, it was pretty straightforward.
Right.
So
when yeah, as a seller, if I get a contract that has line 49 checked and it's filled out, I'm feeling pretty good.
Yep.
Right. That's, oh, they've already got an offer. Like we've already jumped through the majority of hoops. Right. We just need to make sure it's cleared. All right, and make sure it closes. Whereas if I get an offer with, you know, line 7 checked and all this stuff filled out, then I know that this is pretty weak.
They have a harder time taking that off of right, changing that status. They're losing potential by doing that, and the risk is greater to the seller than to the buyer.
The risk is greater to the seller at that point, and for the buyers, the risk is greater to wait until their house is under contract before they do. So you got to push and pull around that, and that's
correct.
That's just working with your buyers and working with your sellers and making sure everybody understands what's going on. So that's our job, right? Explain, and let them give them enough information to make the right decisions, right? So I hope this helped being able to explain this document well with buyers, especially as we get into a more balanced market where this is actually going to be a potential out there again, right? We can use this in a super seller's market. These things are just poison, so nobody can go under contract with contingency at all. But now we're going to see more and more of them, and I hope that helped explaining how to work this contract and how to make it all work together for your clients.
Thanks, Chris.
So, absolutely. I will put this up on YouTube, and I think I screwed up putting the last one up, so I will I'll retry that. It didn't work, but I'll put it up on the YouTube channel, and it'll be available. And yeah, holler at me if you have any questions, and do me a favor and spread that word. Again, I'll be up there on Wednesday for the partners meeting, doing some stuff, and but just spread the word. Like, Chris is still your guy. Call him.
Okay.
All right. I appreciate you.